Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. Today we will discuss the United States South Asia policy. It's exactly 1 year since the new American President Donald Trump announced his South Asia policy with a special focus on Afghanistan. The South Asia policy had three distinct features. On the one hand, he dumped Barack Obama's timetable-based troop presence in Afghanistan. And secondly, he publicly scolded the Pakistani state for aiding and abetting terror elements which are spreading terrorism in Afghanistan and other parts in the neighborhood. And thirdly, he also requested India to increase its reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. It's 1 year since this new South Asia strategy has been unveiled. So it's perhaps a good idea to take a look at the successes and failures of this policy by the United States of America. To discuss this and more, I have with me in the studio Dr. Bharat Gopalaswamy. Bharat Gopalaswamy is the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in the Washington, D.C. Bharat, welcome to the National Security Conversation.
Thank you.
Bharat, let me start by asking you about your assessment of Washington's new Afghan policy. What, in your opinion, are its successes and failures, given the fact that since the last 1 year, since the unveiling of this new strategy, Afghanistan has seen some of the worst violence since the US-led invasion of Afghanistan almost 17 years ago. So what are your impressions of this strategy?
I think, the impressions of the strategy are, this has been an indicator and a validation of the intellectual consensus of what a South Asia strategy or so-called United States strategy towards India, Pakistan and Afghanistan should look like. Now, we talk about the violence, the implementation of the policy is the biggest challenge. But the core benchmark for the implementation of this policy is 1 year later, what the successes are, and our understanding and our challenges. We've not defined the metrics of those challenges. Right. And what does success look like? Okay, we've defined that as a conditions-based approach. Now, if the conditions-based approach is a reduction in violence, then of course we have a lot of work to do. But now, but one of the conditions I would also, to my mind, is the success is holding the elections in Afghanistan. So we want to make sure that the elections are conducted. We want to make sure that the civilian government that elected in Afghanistan can fulfill its term. There is a successful power sharing agreement. So those are yet to be seen. At some levels, 1 year time frame is too short of a benchmark.
Bharat, do you think this was a complete break from the earlier policy that the United States had adopted towards Afghanistan, for example? Specifically, I think there's one aspect of it, which is the timetable-based troop presence in Afghanistan. That was probably one major break with the past.
I would rather more characterize it as a criticism. And this has been the vocal advocacy of many of these constituencies, saying that if you the biggest criticism was if you provide a time-based approach, then the Taliban or the enemies, the United States as adversaries, will wait it out, will know until when exactly to wait it out, so that they can fulfill the void once the United States leaves. But now the bigger shift is conditions on the ground, and now that in some sense signals an open-ended American commitment. So in that terms, if you want to put it, it's a departure from the policy where the United States is saying, listen, we are committed, Afghanistan is an American project, we are committed to this project. And think about, also put this into context. Donald Trump fought this election, or Steve Bannon and all this constituency fought this election on an America First agenda, and there was a so-called Afghan war fatigue, or the United States should not be intervening so much in the world as it has always been in the past. And now, when you put a conditions-based approach and you don't put a timeline on it, then that's a reversal of one of the Trump's agenda, so to speak.
But Bharat, it is also true that Trump was not very keen on a continued troop presence in Afghanistan. Maybe he was persuaded by some of his staffers. So you think he's become more committed over the past 1 year, or is he still ambivalent about it?
No, I think you're right, and I think there is a large amount of constituency, and whatever reports that I've read and understood and spoken to people, I understand Trump wasn't very willing to commit himself. My conjunctural evidence, it suggests that there is a fair amount of consensus and a shared understanding inside the establishment of the United States that nation building in Afghanistan, or the war in Afghanistan, or the United States project in Afghanistan is as important to us. And we need to make sure that we leave it in a slightly better, at least in a slightly better place.
So in a sense, the establishment in Washington DC has probably managed to prevail over Trump's initial hesitations about.
Yeah, I think that's a case that we could argue out here.
Right. But the other element of this strategy has been his request to India to involve itself more in Afghanistan. In the past, the American administrations have consistently argued that India should play a major role, but they have always said that India should probably play a reconstruction sort of a role, and has never invited India to be on the high table of negotiations. Even this administration hasn't. So how do you sort of view Trump's or Trump administration's request that India should play a role in Afghanistan? What kind of a role?
At a bigger level, at a macro level, I think the Trump administration has recognized India as a responsible power in many parts of the world. You talk about the Indo-Pacific, they recognize India's role in the Indo-Pacific. You recognize Afghanistan, they recognize India's role in Afghanistan. And India has been that relatively stable partner that the United States has always seen. And that's something that this administration has openly called out or validated India's role in some of these areas. When it comes to Afghanistan, they've also known that India is not the problem. The Indians have effectively made by being a responsible power, they've demonstrated themselves to be a responsible power when it comes to Afghanistan. Now, in terms of reconstruction efforts, India has always been one of the biggest donors to Afghanistan. The Indian sentiment in Afghanistan is very positive, very high, and the Indian goodwill is very well appreciated in Afghanistan. There is a lot of exchange, people-to-people ties within Afghanistan. So that sentiment, we have to take good advantage of that sentiment. In terms of what specifically India can offer is increased private sector participation and investment. You look at, I think, sometime around last week or one of these days, the USAID had a big event in Washington, D.C., looking at India, a roadmap, a roadshow of an Indian investors roadshow promoting the investment opportunities in Afghanistan. September 14th, 15th, if I'm not mistaken, the dates, there is a roadshow in Mumbai organized by the USAID with the US mission out here to promote Afghanistan as an investment destination for Indian investors per se.
Right, Bharat, I mean, focusing on that question a little more, there have been reports of Indo-Russian informal agreements to carry out joint projects in Afghanistan. China and India agreed in Wuhan to carry out a joint project in Afghanistan. And at one level, the Americans are a little concerned about the increasing presence of China and Russia in Afghanistan and the region in general. So how does Washington view these informal agreements or formal agreements between India, China, and India and Russia to carry out joint projects in Afghanistan?
And I think you should also mention Iran in this context too, right? So I think the Iranians and the Russians definitely have an interest in Afghanistan where the American project does not succeed. Okay, and they're going to do everything within their powers to make sure that they don't succeed. But it's also in their interest and power to make sure that the Americans do not fail in Afghanistan.
Interesting.
Right? So you want to keep the temperature only to that level where you want to keep the pot boiling.
Well, what do you mean by that? That the Russians and the Iranians are clear that they do not want the Americans to fail in Afghanistan? What does that mean?
In the sense, like, if Afghanistan falls apart for say tomorrow, we don't know what failure in Afghanistan looks like, number one. Are we going to just after the Taliban days? Who is in power? What is in power? Which are the districts? How are they divided? And what is going to happen? And who do you talk to? And that means all these countries share some kind of a geographical proximity with Afghanistan. There is an ethnic division, shared ethnic roots with Afghanistan, and that's not what most of these countries would desire, including Iran. Iran would not want an unstable Afghanistan on its border, neither will the Pakistanis want it, neither will the Indians want it, neither will the Russians want it, neither will the Chinese want it. But when you have an American presence in Afghanistan, there is some sort of stability despite the increasing violence. You still have a functioning government, you still have some kind of an economy. There are a number of positive headlines one could point to. The women's empowerment in Afghanistan is much better than where it was from the Taliban days. You've had the women's robotic team win a first prize competition in Washington, D.C. just under a year ago. So these are the kind of headlines that the Afghanistan has been able to project in the last 16, 17 years, despite all the violence, despite all the bad headlines that's going through.
Right, understood. So to go back to my previous question, so the Americans are not too concerned about the increasing Sino-Indian or Sino-Russian cooperation in Afghanistan, which is not too much, of course, but even whatever is there, they're not too concerned about it.
Right, because I think they know in terms of India, they have a reliable partner. And they know, and they're also very clear in their mind that these are very specific infrastructure projects, these are very specific reconstruction projects, and that serves the American interest too. It is financed by somebody, executed by somebody, so the risk is shared, the dividends are multiplied if somebody builds these things. It's in an American interest to leave a stable Afghanistan behind. Right. Now, when it comes to harming American interest is where America is concerned, but that's happening anyway.
We'll come to that in a second. Bharat, you've written in the past that Trump's new policy provides Secretary Mattis and his commanders flexibility in shaping the deployment of U.S. forces and provides more flexible authorities for the use of those forces in support of Afghanistan and the counterterrorism mission. Yes, it has provided a certain amount of flexibility, but how come this has not led to any significant achievements on the ground? As I mentioned earlier, this has been the worst year since the invasion of Afghanistan 17 years ago. So on the ground, nothing, the violence doesn't seem to have changed despite the sort of independence or flexibility given to local commanders. How do you sort of?
I mean, like the critics of this would be saying that the strategy primarily focuses on the kinetics. You know, it does not focus on the other side, the reconciliation, the talks with Taliban, the political efforts. And, you know, part of our, while Secretary Mattis has been given this mandate, we also have to underscore that this policy can only succeed with the political politics and diplomacy as well, and I buy that argument. But I think where you will see this bearing fruit, this might be a short-term reaction in the 1 year, which you're witnessing because of Trump's or the administration's increased kinetic efforts in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But you have to also underscore what is not being said is about how the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia now have been playing a role in helping the United States achieve its end goals in Afghanistan. At the international level, you have Pakistan on the FATF gray list, which is a significant effort. We didn't see that in the Obama administration. You have the Saudis in the last month hosting a conference for the Taliban leaders, where they invited many of these Taliban leaders to provide a religious angle to this conflict. You have the United Arab Emirates government working with the Afghan government to try to see if they can position themselves to do an investment conference. Right. So there is a large level international diplomacy and policy efforts that's aimed at aiding the strategy on the ground and squeezing the problem, the so-called problem elements to that level that they eventually give up this kind of resort to this kinds of methods. And I would say it gets worse. It would, analytically speaking, it's gotten worse, and now it has the potential to get better because the screws are being slowly tightened on where the pressure points are.
In other words, you're saying that 1 year is probably not enough for us to make an assessment of a key policy such as this in sort of stabilizing Afghanistan. The governance crisis in Washington, D.C. and the shrinking of the State Department and its finances, have they had an impact on the Americas?
Certainly. I think with the Rex Tillerson, the morale was so low in the State Department under the former Secretary of State. The budget cuts were, and under that leadership, I think State Department shrunk the morale amongst the officers, and looking at Afghanistan simply was not a priority for Secretary Tillerson.
Yeah.
Now for Secretary Pompeo, who is given who I believe has a greater confidence with the president, has been given a mandate, has been given asked, to the extent today even we are looking at news reports where Zalmay Khalilzad could be a special envoy. Reuters reported a few hours ago that Zal Khalilzad might be the new envoy for this particular project. So, which means things are picking up. There is a recognition that this is an important area that the United States should focus on. So that's where I think there is a renewed focus. And of course, there has also been an administration distraction overall with the Mueller investigation, and the internal.
Government skies in Washington.
Yeah, I didn't say that. You said it. But these are. There has been some kind of, this has caused a burden on the administration, the White House itself.
You mentioned Zalmay Khalilzad could probably be appointed as the points person for Afghanistan. Given the fact that he comes from Afghanistan, he has a certain Afghan origin, you think it's a good idea, or do you think someone else should have been?
Well, I think
appointed?
the right person with the right skills and the right qualifications should get the job. In anywhere. I'm not going to say in terms of ethnicity, or I'm not going to qualify an ethnicity. Zalmay Khalilzad has served in the U.S. establishments for the last 20-25 years in some form of capacity or the other. He's had a significant experience as the first United States ambassador to Afghanistan after the war. He served in Iraq. He understands the Middle East. He understands Afghanistan. He served at the United Nations at a multilateral level. So he understands multilateralism and a regional politics, and has an on-the-field experience, and also has a Washington experience, and he's embedded in the Washington network.
In a place like Afghanistan, probably the ethnicity will also make a difference, because it's a very complicated country. It's not one of those European countries, but you need to have a certain set of skills to deal with the mess in Afghanistan. But I want to also discuss with you on Washington's view on China's role in the region. On the 6th of August, the Financial Times reported that Chinese officials had reportedly met the Afghan Taliban several times in the past year, and Islamabad had acted as a broker for the Taliban, helping it to set up negotiations with both China and the United States. So there's the US on the one hand talking to the Taliban, then there is Chinese talking to the Taliban,
the Russians too.
and the Russians too. Is there any coordination happening among these various forces? Of course, there is the quadrilateral group that has met the Taliban in the past. But at this point of time, is there any coordination happening among China, Pakistan, Russia, and the United States on negotiating with the Taliban?
I'm not aware that what level of coordination and where this coordination and who's this coordination run by, if there is any coordination to play with, to begin with. But it also is an important question to ask, who are this Taliban that all of these countries are speaking to?
Interesting.
Where are these the real power centers? Are they speaking to the right Taliban? Or every Taliban, are they just the messengers? Or are they the decision makers? Where will they have to refer any conversations to come back with a decision to say, what next? Okay, we hear you, we understand you, these are your problems. Okay, let me go back to my boss, ask them if this is the action that we want you to take or not. Right. So where is the headquarters of this Taliban, where the decisions are made? Are these just the Taliban embassies? Are the Taliban headquarters? So I think that's the more important question that we should be asking.
Well, I also want to push you a little more on the Russian engagement in the region. The feeling that I get sitting in Delhi is that Washington is more concerned about Moscow these days than about Beijing. So it may be, it's probably possible that the Americans look at the Chinese involvement in the region in a more sort of receptive manner than, say, the Russian interference or engagement in Afghanistan and in the region. In fact, as of next month, there is going to be a peace conference in Russia, in Moscow, and Russia says that it has invited the Taliban and 12 countries. India is part of that, China is part of that, US is part of that. Both US and Afghanistan have said
September
that
5th, right?
in September 5th.
Which is your 2+2.
Which was the 2+2, yes. So both Afghanistan and the United States have said that they will not participate in it. So the feeling that one gets from that statement is that the Americans aren't too pleased with the Russians meddling in the affairs of Afghanistan. How do you look at it?
You have to compartmentalize the United States relationship with China and the United States relationship with Russia, right? There is a different kind of feeling with the Chinese about what they've been doing generally in the Asia Pacific and what the Russians might potentially do. And you have to, the context here is what the Russians have been doing in Syria, in the Middle East, how they have been trying to wield their influence in the Middle East, and how they have been trying to complicate American interests in the Middle East. And that's the same thing with, that's the same amount of a deep mistrust and a deep sense of fear when it comes to Russia's involvement in Afghanistan.
Interesting.
And put this into the context of what the US domestic politics in which Trump is being attacked by being so close to Russia. Or there is a perception that Trump wields his power with everybody, but with Russia, when it comes to Russia, he's a little bit softer. And the question is, why is that? And that brings into the collusion angle, the Mueller investigation, and everything. There have been domestic criticisms about Trump that limits his ability when it comes to Russia. But that said, I think, and when the Russians, the more important thing is, when Russia engages the Taliban, suddenly it's Russia asserting its influence in Afghanistan in a way that they never had before. It was all hush-hush. There were reports of them supplying weapons and money to the Taliban, and now suddenly they become, at the political level, they want to be part of the peacemaking process or the brokering process. Now, where does that leave the Americans? So is that a decline of American influence? Or is it an increase of Russian influence that once they had, and suddenly it makes Putin looks like a more important statesman?
But from a Russian point of view, I think this is an absolutely fascinating strategy that they are following.
They've got nothing to lose.
They've got nothing to lose. They only have something to gain at the end of it all. You in passing mentioned Iran. How does the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, affect the geopolitics in Afghanistan and in the neighborhood?
Well, I mean, look, we've abrogated the deal with the Iranians. That deal opened the way for a limited engagement, and there was an incentive with the Iranians, from the Iranian side, that once you strike a deal, it provides them an opening for their own economy, and they might have a shared interest in addressing some of these shared concerns for the United States. Now, what interest do they have anymore in supporting the United States in any of their interests, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in Iran, or whether it's in the broader Middle East region, right? So we could make that argument. And now, once you have done that, and with the United States has now gone to various countries asking them to cut their oil supplies from the Iranians, and that pressure, if they start wielding that pressure, why are the Iranians going to be any supportive of their countries when they succumb to the American pressure?
So you are saying that this is going to make the American policy in Afghanistan more difficult to achieve its aims, because of the withdrawal from the JCPOA?
Yeah, it's going to make it at the least, it's not going to make it easy.
All right.
Right? I mean, why would, if you needed any Iranian assistance tomorrow in Afghanistan, which I'm sure you do at some levels.
Or do you think it was a good strategy by Washington to withdraw from the JCPOA?
Well, I think it was an election promise that Trump made.
Okay.
And he had to play to that election promise. And there is an understanding among some of the Republicans that the deal was, the United States gave away a deal too cheaply to the Iranians. They've even, Zalmay Khalilzad himself has written many of these op-eds where he said, don't forget the Iranian economy. And they found the easiest way to squeeze the Iranian economy was increase the sanctions. And they've seen the power of American sanctions. And that's what they have done to take the sanctions to a new level.
One question about US-Pakistan relations. You've been working on that as well. The Trump administration suspended all security assistance in January this year to increase the pressure. and Pakistan has been named to the Financial Action Task Force grey list for its insufficient controls on financial flows to terrorist groups. Pakistani participation in the international military education and training programs have been curtailed. With decreasing US funds to Pakistan, the American ability to influence Pakistan is going to be much less in the days to come. So how do you sort of evaluate US-Pakistan relations as they're going to unfold in the days to come in this background?
See, I'd still make the argument that America is still a very important partner for the United States. The reason, you see so much of these headlines and you see what is the argument? That Afghanistan is a landlocked country and you need Pakistan to access Afghanistan. But today,
and plus the Pakistanis can create hurdles for you in Afghanistan. Yes,
and they've been doing that anyway. I think there is the establishment right now, the American establishment right now is frustrated. The reason you see all these things is because there is a level of frustration that they've displayed, saying, listen, you've been doing this double speak with us. On one hand, you take our money and then you also give it to the Taliban to kill our own troops, and this is an endless mechanism, and that's the allegation that's been going around. But look, United States is still a preeminent power. And if you ask the Pakistanis, they still want a robust relationship with the United States. For its economy, for its power in technology, for its power in innovation, for its university systems, for its ability to influence the international system, including that of the IMF. So all these kinds of things, the United States still wields considerable influence. So it's not that the United States has no leverage over Pakistan. It's just today China may be a new best friend in so many ways, but there are also limits to that cooperation too. Chinese projects are all tied as heavily strings attached in Pakistan, such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor or the Belt and Road Initiative. They're all strings attached, which the American power did not have.
But can the Americans do without Pakistan in Afghanistan?
I don't think so. At the end of the day, you all need to. The Americans and the Pakistanis need to work together. Yeah. I think the Americans are developing alternate partners and friends in the form of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, even trying to court Indonesia to support them in their efforts in Afghanistan. But so the Americans have tried a lot of things. So for a change, what they're trying to do is try maximum pressure with Pakistan to achieve their results in Afghanistan. And let's give them a fair chance. Let's give ourselves a fair chance to see if this strategy would succeed.
So what are the perceptions in Washington on Imran Khan's Afghan policy or foreign policy in general, or policy towards the United States? Look, he has a certain history, and he
has a certain history, and there are these reports calling him the Taliban Khan, as sympathetic views towards the Taliban and stuff. But that's been largely portrayed by the media. Right. That's how he's been portrayed. But the understanding there is also fairly mature in the sense they all know that the files in Afghanistan, India, America rest largely with the military.
That's correct.
And that continuity is not going to change, and they're going to see how Imran Khan himself is going to address that status quo with the military to see how much of control he can exercise, or whether he can exercise any control when it comes to these kinds of policies, whether vis-a-vis India or vis-a-vis the United States or for Afghanistan.
But it's not necessarily a bad thing if Imran Khan, as the Indian media or the international media reported, if Imran Khan is sort of directed by the Pakistan army, if he is close to the Pakistan army, if there is an elite consensus in Pakistan, it's not bad.
And he becomes a credible interlocutor.
Absolutely.
All along, the problem was, the shared problem, and the view was, the A teams of every country would speak to the B team in Pakistan.
That's correct.
Correct? And now perhaps you probably have a B team or a member of the A team being the captain of the B team.
Absolutely. I think.
And if that is the understanding, and if that is the optics that he can successfully play and also becomes a credible interlocutor, then that is perhaps not necessarily a bad thing, because we all know where the problem is, and And I think the bottom line at many people in Washington have asked, what does, even President Ghani asked last year, was what does Pakistan need? What are its core national security interests?
Yeah.
That need to be addressed so that we can put an end to our conflict in Afghanistan.
I mean, even recently you had Alice Wells, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, meeting the army chief in Pakistan. So I think that's the lesson even for India, that you need to reach out to the real powers in Pakistan, and there's no point in going on talking about the divergent power standards in Pakistan. It's not going to help your national interest. But my last question to you, Bharat, is about the upcoming 2+2 ministerial meeting. What are your expectations of the? It's going to be, I think, on the 5th of next month, as you pointed out. What are your expectations? This was postponed twice, at least. Why was it postponed in the first place?
I think it's primarily, as you would say, the United States has been distracted with Korea. It's been distracted internally.
But it created a lot of bad optics in India, though.
Correct. I mean, it created a, but you have to understand that people in the United States are also people. They're also politicians. It's a democracy, and it's also chaotic at the best of times. And then there are, and they're also prone to confusion, and confusion, and it's just what it is. I don't think I don't think it's deliberated. There is no conspiracy. I think they do, but in some sense, I would even argue that this is 2018. In 1998, India was a sanctioned country.
Yeah.
And you're having a 2+2 dialogue at the Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense level. Who would have thought in 1998, in 20 years from now, this is the level where both our countries would elevate our relationship. And also remember, India is not, as far as I understand, India is not a cause of concern for the United States. There may be a cause of frustration for both countries, because we're just large democracies and we're just unique countries in our own right and might. And so some of these things
There's a lot of chaotic domestic politics.
They're chaotic domestic politics, and we understand both our executive branches are susceptible to these kinds of domestic policy pressures, and there are election promises and campaign promises that the politicians have to fulfill. So we've taken the luxury, which might be again a wrong way of putting it, in the sense saying, India is not my cause for concern. Yeah, let's deal with this problem. We know Indians are our friends. They don't mean harm to us, or the United States don't mean harm to us necessarily in so many ways. So let's discuss and talk. It's like, let me get out of this problem, and I will just discuss this problem once this is beyond my back. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a positive thing.
Well, what are your expectations from this meeting?
I think I'm not going to raise my expectations per se, but I think what will dominate is the trade agenda for this meeting. I think trade has been on top of the president's mind wherever you go. You see the United States ambassador here talking about trade everywhere, and I think that will play a significant role in some of these. Although it's not part of the agenda in a big way, but I think it's going to dominate. But what's going to be on the agenda is how you're going to, the Indo-Pacific vision. Mm-hmm. Secretary Pompeo giving a speech at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's instructive that he gives it at the United States Chamber of Commerce with the Commerce Secretary, with the, so economics. What is the vision for Indo-Pacific, how the United States and India could work towards achieving that vision. And I think that's where you will see bulk of the action and item. That's been on Pompeo's high list.
Bharat, wonderful talking to you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.